Hello and good evening. Welcome everyone to Delta Institute's annual Green Soapbox event. We are very excited to have you here this evening for an engaging discussion on climate refugees, one of the most pressing yet often overlooked aspects of climate change. My name is Maya Kelly and I'm one of the Delta emerging leaders here at the Delta Institute, here to kick things off this evening. Before we get things started, I do have a few housekeeping items for everyone. Number one, if you do need to use the washroom, please feel free to at any time. It is just around the corner in the center of the building here. Number two, we'll have an opportunity in the final half hour for guests to ask questions on our panel. So please don't be shy for asking questions, but please do hold all questions till the end. Number three, after Q&A wraps up, we will, you are more than welcome to grab another bite around the corner before we close the event down at 8 p.m. Last call for beer and wine will be at 7:40 p.m. And finally, if you have any other questions about Delta Institute, the Dells are in need of any technical support, please feel free to ask me or any of the other Dells present here this evening, all right? Fantastic. Well, now I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to Delta Institute's CEO, Bill Schleiser, who will now share more about Delta's work. Bill oversees Delta's programmatic strategy, operations, engagement, and fundraising efforts as Delta CEO. From 2011 to 2015, he served as a managing director, guiding project implementation across several areas, including those related to environmental markets, climate, agriculture, water, and ecosystems, and has been on Delta staff since 2004. He serves on the Cook County Commission for Social Innovation. In 2019, Crane Chicago Business named Bill a Chief Executive, and then in 2002 also named him a notable leader in sustainability. So everyone, if you could please welcome Bill Schleiser.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Maya, for that great introduction. It's hard to follow that up, and especially with a topic like this. So thank you all for coming out tonight to talk about this very critical topic at a time when it feels like it's hard to talk about these things aloud. It's really, really wonderful to see such a packed room here tonight, and it's really moving. But before we jump into this and talk about this critical conversation, you know, I'll be jumping up on my soapbox, and that's why Green Soapbox was actually created by the Dells almost 13 years ago, or even longer than that. It's to have a space to get up and talk about those things that are important to all of us, and to talk about those words that and movements that really need to be visible. So we're gonna do that tonight, and I'm very excited about that because we have the droughts, fires, floods, freezes. I'm throwing shit around and everything. And we can see the escalating climate impacts that are happening to our friends, our families, and folks from around the region and globally. And regardless of what people want us to do, which is to ignore these pressing issues, we're here tonight to talk about it, to connect around it, and create community around it. And that's the whole point. And for me, it's very personal because back when I was a less seasoned Delta employee, I was talking to one of our regional planning organization partners, asking them the question, how are you factoring in people moving into the Great Lakes into your planning? These are the planners that set the big plans where and how traffic is invested in, how our buildings are invested in, our communities are invested in. And the answer after a pause and being looked at like I was an alien for even asking that question was, well, we don't. We use our formula that looks at past demographics and population movement to predict what's going to happen in the future. So we run into this problem with climate all the time, is that we're trying to look at the past for the future. And we know that the future is not going to be like the past. As much as people want to make us think that the past is a better place to be, we know that it's not going to be that moving forward. So I'm really excited for the panel tonight. From my own experience, we know this is a topic that needs to be talked about, but my job is actually supposed to thank you all for coming. Thanks Salesforce for this amazing space. Our sponsors, William Blair, the People's Gas Community Fund, RW Ventures, and J. Blanton Plumbing. And also I want to just thank the Dells now. They did an amazing job putting this together. So let's give them a round of applause first. So the Delta in Delta Institute means change. You know, people want to move us backwards, but we want to change our communities across the Midwest. And we as a 501c3 nonprofit work directly with communities to move complex environmental challenges forward, upward, and onwards. And we do that looking both at environmental quality, economic development opportunity and center our work in community priorities. And we do that right now through 3 programmatic areas. We do that in nature-based climate solutions, where we're working directly with communities to integrate and scale up green and natural infrastructure, specifically in those communities that are most impacted by flooding and climate change. We're doing it in a resilient agriculture portfolio by working with farmers across the landscape in the Midwest to rebuild soil health, which includes programs like actually getting soil health used as a land appraisal tool so you can value good environmental practices into the actual land value. And then we also do that through our sustainability and support services, where we're connecting with communities on the ground with their sustainability priorities and really working with them through our technical experience to move that all forward. So tonight, through this and all the programs we do at Delta Institute, we touch millions of people every year, and we are going to continue to have these conversations, work with you all to have the solutions that actually continue to move us forward. We need to build that community. We need to talk about these tough things. I know it's really hard at this time to do it. It's really easy to feel fear, helplessness, hopelessness, and harbor that resentment, but we have an opportunity and we have the power in community to continue to live our values and to do the work that's important to us today. So I'm really excited to leave this podium for the actual stars of the show, our panelists. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Bill. As you enjoy this evening, consider if you or someone you know would like to get involved in volunteering and organizing events like this with this amazing organization. Starting on Monday, we are actually opening up applications for new members to join our Associates Board. The Dells serve for a 1-year renewable term beginning on July 1st to help organize fundraising events such as this Green Soapbox or annual Boost event, which celebrates sustainability and entrepreneurship. This year's application to join the Dells closes on May 1st, and there's plenty of more information about what you can expect by joining the Dells. You can find by visiting online at deltainstitute.org/DELS/Dells. And one more thing before we begin, as you think of all the ways you can support the Delta Institute, you may have seen, we do have a silent auction this evening with a lot of great goodies featuring different local businesses here in Chicago. So be sure to check your email reminders as well as QR codes found around the building today with more information about the silent auction. The auction will close online next week, so the winner doesn't have to be present like right now this evening, but all proceeds do go to support the work being done at Delta Institute. So please check it out. So this evening, we've got a really great panel set up for you. We'll hear from experts and advocates who can help us better understand the intersections of climate change, migration, and policy. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce a very simple yet surprisingly complicated question for you all, which is, what is a climate refugee? The term climate refugee is often used to describe people displaced by climate-related disasters such as hurricanes or wildfires, yet its accuracy and implications remain pretty wildly debating. Nations estimates that there's an average of 21.5 million people are forced from their homes each year due to weather-related events. Although despite this, however, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, does not officially endorse the term climate refugees, instead preferring persons displaced in the context of climate disasters. This distinction is not just about vocabulary. Refugee law traditionally is often designed to address state and individual situations, making it difficult to address a topic as complex and nuanced as climate change. In addition, some argue that the UN's hesitancy to formally recognize climate refugees is less about linguistic precision and more about legal obligations that would require and grant such people international protections. So beyond the legal definitions, the broader conversation around climate migration is still complex. Some argue that labeling all displaced people as climate refugees is rather oversimplifying their experience, while others argue for a more comprehensive approach that recognizes the diversity of reasons people move and the challenges that they face. So with that, this evening, regardless of which label you choose to use, it is important to understand that the issue of climate refugees is not new, nor is it for the global other. It is an increasingly old and increasingly local issue. Climate-driven displacement has shaped human history for centuries, even if we've not always used that particular phrase. One of the most recent examples in US history, in fact, is actually the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when extreme drought and soil degradation forced hundreds of thousands of people, often called Okies, to flee the Great Plains in search of work and stability. These migrants, headed for places like California, faced economic hardship, discrimination, and legal barriers, much like displaced people today. Though the displacement is caused by a mix of environmental mismanagement and climate variability, its consequences mirror modern climate displacement, showing that the struggle to adapt and relocate is by no means new. In fact, at the same time, climate migration is becoming increasingly more visible and immediate in the United States. In 2004, catastrophic flooding caused by Hurricane Helene in North Carolina displaced entire communities, particularly in low-lying and historically marginalized areas. Hurricanes like Florence in 2018 and Matthew in 2016 caused widespread destruction, leaving residents little choice but to abandon their homes. Some chose to return and rebuild, only to be flooded out again, while others have relocated permanently to areas less prone to disaster. And these are just two images, but I could keep going with this list for ages. All of these movements, whether forced by sudden disasters or by slow onset environmental changes, demonstrate that climate migration is not just a distant concern, but a reality unfolding right now in American communities. As climate change and climate-related disasters grow more frequent and severe, we must prepare to address and support those seeking refuge from these environmental crises. This is not a challenge for some distant future. It's a continuation of a story that has been playing out for generations in communities across the globe. So with this in mind, why is this relevant to the Midwest in particular, and especially, I would argue? That is because the Midwest, and particularly Chicago, is emerging as a potential climate haven due to its freshwater resources and relative insulation from climate weather. So we have access to the Great Lakes. 20% of all Earth's fresh water is right in our very own backyards, in addition to gorgeous summers and increasingly more mild winters far away from rising sea levels. So, with this in mind, studies performed by U.S. Census data indicate that climate migration is already reshaping U.S. demographics, with Cook County receiving the 7th most climate-related moves in the country since 2010. So, as climate displacement accelerates, understanding and preparing for these shifts will be crucial for communities across our region. So, which is why we're very excited to have you all here discussing this topic with you today. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce this evening's moderator, Tomás de Medici. Tomás is an expert in community-focused infrastructure planning and innovative business strategies. His first firm, TdM Emerald Corp, reflects and crafts project development models that meet contemporary needs. Prior to his work in Introductory Energy Partners developing solar projects in rural and urban settings, he served as an organizing for America field organizer in Florida during the 2012 Obama campaign, and founded the Chicago Sustainability Series, a multimedia initiative exploring diverse perspectives in climate leadership. He was an advisor of the Turnstone Development C40 Reinventing Cities Competition Task Force, as well as an environment, climate, and energy planning member of the City of Chicago's We Will Chicago initiative. He served as the Chicago Community Trust Young Leaders Fund co-chair from 2018 to 2020, and policies under its Next Generation Advisory Board from 2017 to 2020. So, without further ado, please welcome Tomás.
Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Can everyone hear me? All right, wonderful. All right, I got my folks here keeping me honest. All right, how's that? All right. First, I'd like to introduce my panelists. Let's see.
Cool.
Look at that. How's that? All right. The first panelist I want to introduce is Rimjhim Agrawal. She's an expert in climate practice through roles such as promoting energy efficiency financing for Cook County, the Bureau of Economic Development, as well as she's been a visiting professor for climate change and implications for defense and security course at the William J. Perry Center. She's a researcher with the Corioli Institute, and she has delivered projects on the climate change conflict migration nexus in Jordan, Kenya, and the Arab region. She additionally has worked in various roles, including at the World Bank and for the Prime Minister's office in Kurdistan. She holds a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago, and she has worked as a climate disaster risk analyst for 3 years in an international context. Currently, she's serving as the program manager for the Building Energy Resource Hub over at Illinois Green Alliance. Next up, we have Alisa Bhachu. For the past 20 years, she has focused within human rights as an advocate for women and girls, predominantly refugees and asylum seekers, especially those displaced from throughout sub-Saharan Africa. She started her career as an intern with Amnesty International, and from there she went on to lead their national campaigns on refugees and asylum. From 12 to 18, she led Refugee, an award-winning INGO based in Nairobi, Kenya. Currently, she is the executive director of the Chicago Refugee Coalition and is a co-founder of Refugee Can Be. Alisa has been honored as an international leader by Chicago Women Magazine, also named an emerging leader by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She frequently speaks on record and on issues of forced migration, having appeared on BBC, NPR, MSN, ABC, and CBS Primetime News, all of the alphabet soup. As if that was not enough, she also holds certifications in forced migration from Northwestern and Oxford universities, and a BA in humanities and an MA in comparative religions. And finally, Deputy Mayor of Immigrant, Migrant, and Refugee Rights for the City of Chicago, Beatriz Ponce de León, also joins us. She advocates for the integration and advancement of these communities. With over 30 years of experience in public service, she has led initiatives promoting racial justice, equity, and immigrant rights. In addition, she has worked across sectors to help develop policies that strengthen marginalized communities with dignity. She has held key roles in organizations at the Illinois Department of Human Services and led key initiatives at Chicago Public Schools, the Chicago Community Trust, and holds a BA in sociology from a little school in Connecticut called Yale. Please join us.
So last one moment, and just so all of our panelists know, there's a little switch here to turn on your microphone on and off. And if I can just ask everybody to speak right directly into this. We lose you if you go all the way down here. So go ahead and speak directly into the microphone. Thank you.
All right. I went to Trinity, so I was the other school down the road. She went to the better one in Connecticut. So again, thank you everybody for coming out. We want to start with a couple good faith starting points. One, a human being cannot be illegal. They can have immigration status conferred upon them from a structure or a government, but the personhood always comes first. Second, scarcity mindsets and this or that framings are not inherent. Resource allocation is always a choice and it is always within historical context, and thus we have more room to creatively explore it. And finally, climate migration is an inevitable outcome of how societies have worked for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But that does not need to be fatalism. We can approach that with a lot of opportunity. And finally, we want to respect the stories and self-determination and nuance of individuals and communities that are here sharing our city and our state. And so with that, we're going to start with some stories. Rimjhim, you've worked on the climate change conflict and migration nexus in Kenya and Jordan, as well as energy efficiency financing in Illinois. Can you share a story from your research that highlights the resilience of climate migrants, something that often is not going to make headlines?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple stories that really stuck with me was when we were doing research in Kenya, we interviewed people, around 90 people across 2 counties that were pastoralists and agro-pastoralist communities. And these people have been, migration is an inherent human thing that we've been doing for thousands and thousands of years. So pastoralists are people who naturally move with livestock and with their communities. And this is a thing that they've always done. So their migration patterns have been affected by climate change and how climate change has been impacting how disasters are becoming more frequent or more intense. So one of the stories that we heard was someone who, there was a family living close to a river, and because of the flood, they lost everything. They had over 2,000 livestock that they lost, and they lost their home, all of their assets. And they did not receive any support from any government or nonprofit or humanitarian aid entity. So that's where the community stepped in, and that's where the resilience came from. The entire community that they were living in, everyone donated their own livestock to help this family sustain themselves. And I thought that was a really striking story of how communities step up to build resilience within their own people. A second one is that there were certain women, when they are displaced, face higher impacts and more disproportionate impacts of displacement. And there were education and training, livelihood training workshops that were being held for women. And they were not just helping these women get skills that they could use to earn a livelihood, but also acting as places for psychosocial support, because women from the same community were coming together and helping each other out, even though they did not have a formal way of getting that psychosocial support. So I thought that was a very interesting way for women and girls to find that.
I appreciate that, and it's very resonant. Thank you for sharing. I think something that's striking about that is just how natural community is a response to, even if there is not structure. And building upon that, Alisa, with your work in Sub-Saharan Africa, could you share a story of how one individual's journey exemplifies both the challenges folks face and the ability to rebuild their lives with self-determination?
Thank you so much. Can all hear me okay? Great. It's so wonderful to be here with you all tonight, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to share someone's story. Every individual's story is their own to tell, so I want to share that I've received the blessing of this story. But in my experience working in East Africa, I led an NGO called Refugee for 7 years that worked with unaccompanied, separated, the most vulnerable of girls from throughout the region were referred to us by UNHCR. And a young woman who came through our programs, her name is Chantal Zuzi. The first time that I met her, we were in the safe house of Refugee, and she runs up to me with this journal, and it's written in multicolored ink, and there's stickers on there, and she's sharing with me her dream of what she wants to do and what she wants to become with her life. And she wanted to go to work for the UN. Like, that was her big grand goal. She was Congolese. She had been forced to flee Congo when her village was raided. Her parents were killed on her 14th birthday, and she fled with her 8 siblings across the border into a camp right across into Western Uganda called Rimjhim Refugee Camp. Chantal has albinism, and because of that albinism, she is also legally blind. So she navigated extraordinary circumstances to find herself in Rimjhim. And then when she got to Rimjhim, she was sequestered in a cell because the security concerns around her albinism were so severe that her life was at risk. So she lived there for a number of years with her siblings, 2 of whom also had albinism, and said, I just can't languish here anymore. Nothing's going to happen with my life unless I find a way out. So she escaped one night under the darkness of night. She took a bus to Kampala, and she found her way to Nairobi, where the largest UNHCR office is in East Africa. She was referred to Refugee. She had these grand dreams. Our organization helped to resettle her to the US. She graduated high school with honors. She's graduating from Wellesley College this May, and she's launching her own NGO called Refugee Can Be, which I'm like standing in the background trying to help and cheer her along. And that's one example of some of the extraordinary circumstances that refugees come from. And this is where I do think the digging deep into the designation of refugees and what that means and why that was prioritized after World War II by the UN to highlight the most vulnerable of people from throughout the world, to bring countries together to step in to assist, was at that point a very noble cause. And it's something that is systematically being dismantled now underneath the current administration. So that's the success story that I'm happy to share with you. but I can't not acknowledge the 114 million displaced people, many of whom are asylum seekers, who will never have a chance to be resettled. So less than 0.5% of the world's asylum seekers are ever resettled. It is in many ways a golden ticket, which is why what's happening right now with the suspension and dismantlement of the US refugee admissions program and just the all-out assault on people who are on the move, how devastating and sad that is from an international perspective in terms of the role that the United States has played in supporting and resettling, leading the world actually alongside Germany and the European Union for 40, 45, 50 years. So that's just some snapshots of the experiences that I've had.
Thank you for addressing the elephant as well. Again, these are choices, and both of you for providing context for, by the time we even encounter people as a concept or in our borders or in our city, just a small sliver of what they've gone through, what they're persevered for, what resilience actually means, even when it's just a nicely packaged word. And that's one of the things that I'm very proud of in Chicago, that we have these efforts. And your own office and your own role, I believe this is the first time the city has ever done this. Can you talk about how you found that experience, what you've seen in the city, what has worked, just as in these first couple of years? And
Sure. Thank you. And thanks again to the Delta Institute for having us here. And all of you for taking your evening to come and have this conversation with us. It really speaks to what Chicago's about, that we are a city that values the diversity and our immigrant background and our current immigrant communities, because we understand that that's what makes Chicago such a great global city. It's having people from around the world with a variety of talents and backgrounds that make us a more vibrant place to be. I am the Deputy Mayor for Immigrant, Migrant, and Refugee Rights for the City of Chicago. It's the first time that our city has this position, and it really is an honor to have the opportunity to help lead this office, and especially in this moment that we're living not only in Chicago, but in our country. My parents came here from Michoacan, Mexico in 1966, 67. Not sure if they were going to stay. They came a little bit of adventure and risk taking and a little bit of seeking opportunity. And I'm privileged for that because we always had a home to go back to in Mexico, had the community there, and I grew up with a very binational kind of identity. I was born here, and the reason my parents were able to stay here, we don't have those opportunities anymore. And there are attacks on birthright citizenship, as you all know, going on right now. But I always think to my parents' story because they came at a time when there were plenty of jobs, when immigrants were being welcomed, and the need for having more people to contribute to our city was a little bit more understood. I'm not saying there weren't issues with the system, but it was just a lot easier for them. And really all individuals who are seeking to make a life in another place for whatever that reason is should have opportunities for those pathways to become legal permanent residents or ultimately citizens. And I like to start with that story because I am not an immigrant. I grew up here, but I definitely was raised with that experience and saw the impact on many communities. Now being in this role at the city, it's the first time we have this office. By doing so, Mayor Johnson elevated the communities to have more of a focus in the mayor's office across multiple initiatives. And the very first one is that we had to focus on the tens of thousands of people who came to our country from Venezuela, Colombia, Haiti, Senegal. Really was over 20 countries, although those were the top ones. The city wasn't fully prepared for that number of people to arrive so quickly without any federal support. It's the first time that our cities had to basically create refugee type resettlement programs for people that did not have that status and had no federal funding to be used in their resettlement. And we could have made different choices, but we made the choices that our CEO of Delta Institute mentioned, but I'm sorry if your title, if it's president or CEO, but you said something about living in our values. And that's what we often talk about in the Johnson administration, putting our most vulnerable communities first, communities that have been left behind in Chicago for many reasons and many years, including racism and, kind of income inequalities and wealth inequalities. So looking at those most vulnerable communities, that is one of the reasons that this office was started. And the way we responded to the new arrivals mission, as we call it, was based on that. So number one, it was a humanitarian response. We knew that people were coming here with urgent needs for food, medical care, immunizations, shelter. And if we chose to do nothing, they would be living on the street and they would not have any of the resources they needed to find their way in our city. So number one, we responded with a humanitarian mission, and also understanding this sense of agency and people's need to chart their own path. And so connecting them to resources for resettlement. That was very intentional to do both. And then secondly, we set a goal which had kind of an equity lens, but it was to build an infrastructure in our shelter system that really improved our systems of care for other unhoused Chicagoans. Responding in the way that Chicago did was not fully endorsed by everyone around the city. Nobody wanted a shelter in their neighborhood. No, people were concerned that we were putting dollars towards this community of people that were not even US citizens, is what we heard often. And there were concerns that for a long time, Chicago had been struggling to serve our unhoused neighbors. And suddenly we found a way to do that for new arrivals. But those two goals really put us on a path to be able to respond. The city would not have been able to handle this, and it was not perfect by any means. There were mistakes and lessons learned, but we were able to serve over 52,000 people who came through our landing zone. And we would not have been able to do that without a strong partnership with the state and the county. We were the only city in the US that had that partnership of city, state, and county to collectively respond to this urgent need. And we also wouldn't have done it without the Chicagoans and people from the suburbs who came and helped. There were people, buying folks food at the beginning when people were staying in our police stations because we didn't have enough shelter. And that just, again, speaks to what Chicago's about, who Chicagoans are, and how when we do these things together and set some clear goals, we are able to respond to these types of situations.
Thank you for immediately centering the shared humanity and also the shared recognition, and again, precluding any tokenism, and again, all speakers respecting that self-determination. So let's dive into some policy. Rimjhim, assuming we have, let's call them inconsistent policy cycles over the next 20 years. That's only 1 to 4 administrations, maybe. Yeah, sardonic laugh. What 2 reforms, based off your experience and expertise, must be codified now to ensure an efficient, humane system that both supports folks and strengthens our resilience as a region in tandem, not at the exclusion or competition? Please, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really with the current situation and the way that staffing and funding is moving away from giving resources to refugees and migrants. I think it's a space where city, local governments, state governments, and even nonprofits and community organizations would have to step in to provide those services that the federal government should be providing. And so with respect to migrants coming in, I think it's very important to understand, like Beatriz said, agency. What is the agency? Where are people moving? Why are they moving? What are the resources that they are looking for, and what's drawing them to a place? And I think that really helps us sort of understand how people make mobility choices. And like in the beginning of the conversation, it was talked about that climate change may not necessarily be the only driver for movement. There are sudden changes and then there are slow onset changes. And climate change is a threat multiplier. So climate change just exacerbates the vulnerabilities that already exist. So things like communities being hostile towards incoming migrants and refugees and not willing to share resources points to vulnerabilities that exist within those communities. And that can include housing, it can include access to infrastructure and public services, healthcare, education. And as a migrant community comes in, the host community becomes threatened to to share those resources, which are already maybe scarce. And scarcity may not necessarily only mean what's available, it also means who controls the flow of resources and how they're allocated and where they're allocated. So, and I think like this discussion is happening in Chicago, and we have a huge history here of lots of underserved and vulnerable communities, and adding to that, more vulnerable communities just creates further rifts. So I think centering that humanitarian aspect and social cohesion aspect in policy, in the work that we do, that migration is dignified, migrants have agency, and migration is a choice, even though it can be involuntary. Understanding that and centering that in policy, I think, is very important. Globally, there have been frameworks that have been formed for migration. I think collaboration at regional levels is very essential when thinking about migration, because migration does not happen in a silo. It affects a lot of different areas, and understanding migration routes and the resources that are involved there is very important. So as an example, the Global Compact for Migration was formed in 2018 by the UN, and it's non-legally binding, but it provides a blueprint for policy that can be contextualized to the migration scenarios of different states, countries, local governments, etc. And I think that's a really great starting point to think about, to understand the migration realities geographically, and in terms of the demographics and the characteristics of the people who are moving, and make that a little more integrated into how we think about resource provision and resource allocation and reducing vulnerabilities that exist.
Thank you for speaking to the fact that when we see people reacting or expressing things acutely, that is actually an indicator of acute and historical structural harms, and how people manifest that almost, I mean, it's human nature. You have to look beyond that. And so that's crucial for policy. Thank you for speaking to that. Alisa and Beatriz have touched upon expectations, etc. It's designed to overwhelm systems by bad faith actors. That also means we can do things that welcome, that are positive. How do organizations like yours adapt to these dynamics while preserving dignity for those arriving? And how do you take the lessons of the last 10 years as these tactics have changed to prepare proactively? Thank you.
Thanks, Tomás. So what I appreciate about this question is the use of the word adapt and adaptation, because that is exactly what all of us here were doing at the time that the new arrivals began coming in April of 2022. Is that right? August of 2022. And the Chicago Refugee Coalition is a new kid on the block in terms of refugee aid in Chicago. We're 6 years old. We focus on resource distribution. So we have a robust food banking program, and we run a resource center. We're expanding into childcare. And our core mandate and mission was to serve refugees per se. Our founder has family experience as refugees, as Jewish refugees. And what happened is we just approached our board and we said, the need is, it's so great that it really is a humanitarian crisis that is unfolding within our own backyard. What is our moral and ethical obligation to respond to that? So we had made a strategic decision early on that we would pursue diversified funding within our organization, which now we're particularly grateful for. We have never pursued government funding per se. We're funded through foundations and individual donors and fundraisers and things like that. And so we had a lot of flexibility to really pivot and to say, all right, we are going to continue to serve the refugee community, but really our first priority for the next however long this is going to happen, which was 2.5 years, is that we're integrating all new arrivals in the work that we're doing. So we partnered with the city of Chicago to train and mobilize a movement of volunteers. Within a couple of months in the fall of 2022, over 1,200 individuals signed up through our website to volunteer. So we were coordinating, we were dispatching people to police stations, we were running food drives, and that the experience of seeing Chicagoans come together in that moment to take collective action was something that was sort of I'll always take that with me as something sacred that I witnessed, because it was so powerful in conveying the will that Chicagoans have, the generosity, the hospitality that we have culturally here in the Midwest. So one other really important consideration in how we did what we did was that we had all of these volunteers. It was a huge number. It was a really massive growth compared to what we had been seeing as a trend. So we decided to go ahead and create a really robust volunteer online user-directed training. And that included sensitivity and awareness training to help alleviate sort of the otherization that people have when they think about the term migrant, refugee, climate migrant, asylum seeker, and to begin to really humanize everyone with the information and the tools that they needed to go into a situation like a police station, and to serve with humility, cultural awareness, understanding that the majority of all of these individuals, regardless of their own unique claims, have undergone and experienced extraordinary traumas or very, very significant traumas. At the end of the day, people don't want to leave their homes. Most people. Some people electively immigrate and so forth, but the situation that we were seeing was that Venezuelans' quality of life became unbearable, and they were having no choice but to seek other opportunities. So in terms of the training that we did, it's equipped sort of a new movement of supporters in Chicago who can go into settings and go into volunteer opportunities and actually sort of not be called out for their own, sort of savior mentality to try to alleviate someone's suffering. They can be called up to a greater awareness of, a service and a heart of humility and a heart of servanthood service in terms of working with these communities. So those were some of the ways that we sort of adapted to meet the needs of the moment.
Thank you. And I appreciate you addressing that balance of calling people up, still bringing them in, but addressing some of those kind of implicit needs to reframe perspective. For the sake of time, I'm going to combine two questions, maybe Beatriz. So we need structural reform in Chicago, whether it's private equity, whether it's defunding, or structural mismanagement. That's just happens in cities. It's where we are. So as we take some of these lessons and prepare for further support of climate migrants, which will include American citizens, and we take advantage of our unique jewel as a region, how can we proactively prepare while preserving equity for existing residents and work within our current social structure as a city?
Thank you. I want to just piggyback on something Alisa was sharing, because the way you captured the story is really powerful for people to understand. Chicago has a rich infrastructure of nonprofits, social service organizations. We are, and people fighting for rights, workers' rights, civil rights, immigrant rights. We have seen that historically. And we were the birthplace of the settlement house movement. So in the late 1800s, when we saw thousands, hundreds of thousands of European immigrants coming to Chicago, they had legal pathways to emigrate here, but there was still a need for integration. And so the Hull House started, Erie Neighborhood House. Some of the settlement houses are still active today. They're 140 years old or more, and they have done the work of helping connect people to the resources in community and in the city so that they can make their life here. This was, for me, this was a moment of kind of Settlement House 2.0 in that, again, organizations stood up, expanded what they did, created new work streams, brought in new resources, all to help this group of people become integrated and find their way and be on a path to resettlement in Chicago or somewhere else. Sometimes they moved away, but it was truly a phenomenal thing and something that our city should be proud of and that we will continue to learn from. In terms of building infrastructure, I think that human services sector, philanthropy had to stand up, some corporate philanthropy as well. They could have done more, but some did. And then again, that partnership with city, state, and county, and even at the federal level, we advocated for resources there that were not coming our way and wouldn't have come if we had not gone to DC, met with our elected officials, talked to the White House to really push them to fund some work here in Chicago so that we could do the support that we were bringing to these communities. I think all of that prepares us for climate migrants, people who might come here. And it could be because of a big natural disaster, or it could be slowly, as was said at the beginning. We're starting to see a trend of people coming here because of how wonderful our region is on so many levels, and especially climate-wise. But so again, we will have built a stronger infrastructure, both in our communities, in our human services network, funding, but also at the city. So we learned how to quickly open shelters. At one point, we had 15,000 people in our shelter system right on New Year's Day of 2024. So that there were 15,000 people in the shelters. We had opened 28 shelters. That was unheard of. We had never done that super quickly, and did it even though community there was resistance and pushback, and we didn't always have the political support that we needed. But we showed the leadership and the decisiveness to say, we are going to do this. Now we know how to do that. So if we were to receive again another high number of people very quickly, we'd be able to pull that together. We do have the example, Hurricane Maria in 2017. About 2,000 people from Puerto Rico came to Chicago, and the city stood up what was called a multi-agency resource center, a MARC, very similar to what we did on a smaller scale. It was only 2,000 people, but we're able, and because Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, we're able to quickly connect them to resources and housing and all of the things that they needed. There are definitely steps that we now know how to take, and it takes political will and money. And so just one word in terms of us thinking to future needs is it is so important for each and every one of you, all of us, to use our voice and to advocate. So go to a city council meeting, stand up at public comment, and tell the council and the mayor what you want to see. Because we heard every single council meeting, people come and say they did not want migrants in their community, they didn't want shelters. I could count on a hand how many times people came in support of new arrivals, but I saw the support on the street and in community and in organizations. So it makes a difference to have that voice present in those council meetings at the state level. You know, when they say call your elected official, it really does work. People listen, and it forces them to take some action. So just in terms of where we go next, just remember there is so much power in you as residents, us as residents of the city, the state, and this country, to always advocate for the things that we want to see dollars allocated to. If we don't, there will be people on the other side pushing in the other direction. And that's how we can make a mark and be better prepared as we have to make these tough choices down the line.
That's so resonant talking about the balance of advocacy, adding to the chorus, but also empowering entities, public, private, to understand the local perspective on it and to preserve data and, a social service case management infrastructure. I remember in the last year or so, seeing some of the mutual aid groups being like, well, we're going to proactively delete our records just in case. And I understand why that decision was made, but that means Chicago Community Trust has to go allocate new dollars just on data and surveying instead of saying, hey, we have experts who know exactly where this money needs to go. Well, they got to go assess it again. Or we have, constraints about how we can share this information. So
Can I just say something
Absolutely.
building upon what your point, Beatrice? Is that we're in a moment now because of what is happening at the federal level, and maybe I can say this. And we all know that resources are not only just being slashed, but they are they're being threatened as a tool of manipulation and control. And so what this is forcing everyone's hand around is that we can no longer lean on the government funds and support for the humanitarian aid and relief that we need to be doing well within our own state and our own city. So we envision sort of a new movement and a moment that is going to be very distinct around the importance of mutual aid agencies, small, scrappy nonprofits that are working on the community level, faith-based communities, student groups, Girl Scout groups, just anyone and everyone coming out of the woodwork to be empowered individually to actually do something important, because the landscape of how things are going to look once these policies roll out and the decisions are made, we're just sort of seeing the start of it. But what I'm really encouraged around is the culture of service and community that we do have here.
And if you could build upon that by talking about cultural erasure, particularly for the African American experience, and that's not something I can speak to directly, obviously. But when we look at how Black Southerners were displaced by 20th century floods, that is rarely included in climate migration data or stories or advocacy, despite that being an indelible part of the United States history. How do we repair this erasure, learn from it, honor how people currently feel, while also proactively preparing moving forward with some of the models you've already discussed? Thank you.
So I'll be brief because I know we're short on time, but I do believe that condemning the invisibilization, first and foremost, is something that those of us with power and privilege need to be outspoken about. The process itself of repairing is one of ensuring that, one, the injustice and the pain is acknowledged and recognized. Two, we admit the wrong that happened. We apologize for that. I think about the Australian government, the Canadian government, who issued formal apologies to Indigenous people of their land. And then there's a change in behavior, right? We set very clear priorities that moving forward, those who've been overlooked and excluded are going to be prioritized in policy and research moving forward.
I can add just on the city side, because it was very clear, two communities were concerned. One was long-term immigrants who had been here, primarily Mexican immigrants who were undocumented and had lived here maybe 20 years, made a life, and felt like they didn't get all the supports that we were suddenly able to provide for this new group of people. And then certainly not everyone, but members of the Black community in particular, and some communities that have really seen severe disinvestment and are struggling every day with having a healthy and safe community. And what we decided is that we had to acknowledge that, yes, you can understand why people had feelings around these disparities, and we had to do something about it. And so the commitment to improve our systems of care for anyone who is unhoused was very direct for making sure that we were going to come out with a better system. And we called it the One System Initiative. We partnered with the state. We made a firm commitment to work on that. And where we ended up is something, again, that we should be proud of as a city. Chicago for the longest time had only 3,000 beds available in our shelter system. About 80% of people needing shelter were Black Americans. And now we have 7,200 shelter beds available. There is no wait list for families anymore. If you're someone with children and you call for shelter, you will be placed in a shelter within hours instead of maybe weeks or never. That is phenomenal. That we haven't seen that in about 20 years in Chicago. For single adults, we created a place. It's called the Spark, the Shelter Placement and Resource Center, where you can go and wait and you have a place to sleep and eat and stay for a couple weeks until you are placed in a shelter so that you're no longer waiting outside or at a friend's house. That was a commitment from our mayor, from our office, to try to address what people were feeling as having been overlooked for so long. And we made a better system for all. And so as we look, moving forward to address other situations like this, I think keeping in mind the folks who've already been here, who've been overlooked and just, marginalized, keeping them at the center as well is important.
Just gonna piggyback off of what Alisa was saying. I think there's also, with respect to the migrants coming in, there's a perspective of othering, of the cross-border movements as different and climate refugees as sort of other, and this is not an American experience. And I think what we're seeing now in California, Florida, we're going to lose a lot of, we're going to see a lot of sea level rise, and that's going to lead to a lot of displacement, millions of people, and we're already seeing a lot of internal displacement. And internal displacement is also climate displacement. So it isn't just movements across the border that are happening. In fact, most of the displacement that happens because of climate change is internal displacement globally. So I think just putting that into perspective and not going into a panic about how many people are moving in really helps paint a more clear and realistic picture.
Well said, and I appreciate the honey clap, the subdued clap there. It's like slam poetry. I just saw a headline that folks in California are not going to be able to return home because of the wildfires because their soil is contaminated now. Those are Americans. They're going to come here. Building upon that, can you talk about international migration flow and trends, migrant workers in Gulf countries, and best practices that you've seen from the global scope of your work that we can learn from? Thank you.
Yeah, I think from global flows of migration and migrant workers, there's both lessons learned on what to avoid and some good practices. And I think the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, we see a lot of migration from South Asia and East Asia. But the migrant workers that come in, because of the kafala system, which is a sort of system that ties their legal immigration status to their employers, that really limits the rights that they have and limits social protections. And I think that's something that is kind of a fear in the way that we are going right now. And that's something to move away from. But in other places in the world, like in Barcelona or Toronto or Berlin, we see welcoming cities. And I think one of the most important things we see is provision of legal help that is multilingual, that is more accessible, provision of social safety nets, social services, infrastructure, housing, and not workers camps or refugee camps where people are working in conditions of extreme heat. So I think another one, recently I was reading a report that was about worker protections in Qatar, which was workers who are doing construction work in over 50 degrees Celsius weather and have no protections and this is going to be a reality in the US too. The extreme temperatures are becoming more and more common than they were in the century before, and it's going to keep rising. So it's not going to be just a reality that we have to address for migrant workers, but also for American workers themselves. So just placing those social protections, worker protections, providing economic opportunity I think is one of the biggest things, which I think we see a lot of in Canada in terms of welcoming migrants, and legal immigration status, work permits, things like that. Education, healthcare systems, and accessible education and healthcare systems that are, non-discriminatory, accessible to marginalized communities. Yeah.
Alisa, if you could go from there and talk about, we can predict a lot of what's happening and where it's going to go naturally around public health. Thank you. Specific ways you're seeing good results in public health preparation as we welcome both people from California and Indonesia, etc.
That's a really great question. One of the challenges that we came across with the new arrivals was the situation around them needing vaccinations. And in my experience in the press and media, up until that point, there were varied opinions and so forth, but all of a sudden there became op-eds that really started to ignite this public outcry around health. And what's so important to remember, and I think in sort of countering this scapegoating, right, is that there have to be ways that we work to humanize every individual and the sort of journey that they have experienced and chosen, but also the pathways that they want for themselves, and to honor that. And that is a deeply individual, human-centered way of making sure that we're taking into account the full person, the full breadth of who they are and assessing their needs. So we know that the migrants that came from Venezuela, they came here because their quality of living was so harsh that they were unable to pay their rent, they were unable to access medical care in their country of origin. So what we see are inflows, and then the receiving country is the one who gets the opportunity to sort of address that and to meet those needs. And you could probably actually speak better to the healthcare response in Chicago and what we did. But I think that this countering the scapegoating aspect is really just sort of the education around how important compassion and empathy is for every individual and their unique story. And there's a quote that says, once you have taken the time to actually hear someone's story and to listen, it's impossible not to love them. And I think it maybe is Parker Palmer or someone, but I think that's so true. And that's why opportunities to serve, opportunities to get engaged within your own community are so important.
I would like to speak a little bit to the public health piece, because it was another lesson learned and another way that Chicago led in this effort. People in Venezuela are not vaccinated for measles. And so we saw that measles were becoming an issue and debated about whether or not we should require everyone to be vaccinated who was going to be staying in our shelter system. It was not a requirement at the beginning because we thought we should force people to be vaccinated. And it was such another way that our federal government failed us, because people were being allowed to come across the border, be given this temporary permission to be in this country, but no health screenings, no vaccinations, no type of support. And so it was totally up to the cities to decide what to do once folks got here. And our commissioner of the Department of Public Health, Dr. Ige, has worked in refugee camps, and it just was incredible that we had her as a leader in this moment. There was an outbreak of measles, but we vaccinated over 100,000 vaccines were administered that included everything from, the basics and measles to COVID, and just a wide range of vaccines. Most of it was optional. There did come a moment where we decided to make it a requirement for people to stay in the shelter in order to avoid an outbreak of measles. And we knew that U.S. raised folks were not vulnerable because we're all vaccinated for the most part. But it was within the Venezuelan community that people were going to be sick and injured. And then with that possibility of it spreading beyond, we did have an outbreak in our largest shelter and reached out immediately to the CDC for support. They had never had to handle an outbreak of measles in a large congregate shelter. So what Chicago and the state of Illinois did with the CDC was a new experience, and we were able to stop the outbreak pretty rapidly. There were no deaths related to the measles outbreak, and just tens of thousands of people ultimately were then vaccinated against measles. And again, it's another case that the CDC now points to as a way to address these things. But those public health questions are super important from a policy perspective and again, from a funding perspective. Right now, public health funding is being cut drastically across the country. It will impact Chicago's Department of Public Health and other cities. And so we might not have the ability to respond in the same way if we need to do so in the future. But that response also just pointed to the importance of the multiple levels of cooperation in our, governmental entities as well as with community groups.
We could be here for 7 hours. I got the questions. But I'd like to close, assuming this is an audience that is probably wondering, what is a concrete way they can get involved within the next month, either directly, whether it's, sending $5, volunteering, sharing data, sharing their expertise, volunteering, etc., that with each of your organizations and roles, folks can get involved.
I think it's really important for people to understand the entire scope of what climate mobility means, and so that they're able to, communicate that to others. I'm really appreciative of just the size of the crowd in this room. Really happy to see this. Being aware of the landscape, and I think we have info for all of our organizations that Patrick can share, donate, learn about our work, read our work, share our work. I think that's something that's really important and also very helpful to continue the work that's happening.
Thanks. I would say that every single person doing a bit of research and understanding what organizations here in Chicago are doing really good work with new arrivals and with refugees, and then just committing to volunteering with one on a regular basis for at least 1 year. So with my organization, we have a robust volunteer training that takes you from the history of forced migration to placing you with other partner agencies for direct service opportunities with the refugee community. So I would encourage everyone to just kind of do some homework and try to figure out how to make a commitment. I think about the Nobel Peace Prize nominee, Jody Williams. She was really involved in nuclear non-proliferation in the 90s, but she gave a talk that was about doing the one thing, committing to the one cause. If you can have time to reflect on what that cause is for you and then prioritize it in your life to serve once a week, serve once a month. Also, in terms of this crisis, the new arrivals crisis, personally, I see individuals that I'm pretty sure probably are newly arrived sitting out still in front of my Walgreens or on the street corner or at intersections. That is a really real opportunity for each of us to make a point of connection. So I would encourage everyone to do the homework that they feel compelled to do, and then just to commit to one thing.
I always say donate, volunteer, advocate, and I stand on the advocate piece because much of what you said, identifying how you can support, but right now, advocacy is so important. The temporary protective status that was given to over 500,000 people from Ukraine, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, all of that is now not going to be extended, which means over the next 6 or 7 months, people from all of those countries across the US are going to lose their status. They're going to lose their work permits if they have them. It's really a pretty devastating blow to those communities. And so if you could just begin to think about what would happen if suddenly you lost your ability to have a job legally, and what that means for your rent and your livelihood and your family. And we're going to see this across all of these communities. But the folks who are fighting these battles are lawyers right now. I think of COVID, the superheroes were the nurses and doctors, and now the superheroes are lawyers, because they are putting up a fight against all of these changes. So I say, if you care about these situations and feel strongly about it, find a way to advocate for changes there. And if these changes happen and people are impacted, there are many opportunities to support individuals and organizations that are going to help them through this next leg of their journey. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Certainly think they deserve a round of applause. And I believe we have time for maybe 1 to 3 questions, depending on brevity.
Thank you for coming. I really, really appreciate your perspectives and the hard work you do. The question I wanted to start with, Rimjhim's story at the very beginning about this community that really came out to support this family that was struggling after this crisis they had. I guess my question is, a lot of what we've talked about feels like it centers a lot around policy, and as we've seen, that's something that's not really reliably productive in some cases. And Beatriz, you mentioned a lot of the work that Chicago's done that's incredible, but also resistance to that from the community. And Alisa, you've mentioned a lot of stuff around like how people showed up and how important that's been. So I guess one of my questions is, like, a lot of these things to me seem to be a lot of like a social conditioning thing around how climate refugees are perceived. And especially in the current climate, I'm wondering if y'all have any perspectives on what kind of shift can happen or needs to happen and how it could happen to be in solidarity with these individuals, rather than it being these kind of antagonistic relationships that you often see with climate refugees come in either internally or from external countries. And I'm really curious to hear your perspectives on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Great question. I think part of that is just understanding why people are moving and where they're moving, and what they're searching for. Like you said in the beginning, Chicago is a haven, and what are the reasons that Chicago is becoming a haven? It's really far from sea level rise. There's economic opportunity. There's abundance of resources like water. So those are kind of the key things that people are looking for, and that when people are moving, even urbanization as a process, we have seen massive urbanization in the last 50 years. And when it started happening very rapidly, even now as it's happening very rapidly in other countries, it's seen as, why is this happening? Why are people moving from rural areas to urban areas? And that leads to creation of slums. And those people become socially marginalized, and that just kind of continues. So these processes of moving, whether they're internal or cross-border, kind of manifest in similar ways. And that is because of, this is our space, and there are other people coming into our space. So I feel like that perspective really needs to change. For any community to step up, they step up when they think they're stepping up for their own community, right? So I think just changing that perspective of perceiving other communities as, these are our people and we need to help them. And if someone else is seeking resource or opportunity, understanding that they're there to seek resources and opportunity in addition to what other people already have, and not to encroach on someone else's resource or opportunity.
I would only add that having some kind of personal relationship with someone who's had an experience of forced migration in any context, and getting to know them, caring for them, showing up for them in some way, is a very powerful experience to have. And so whatever way you can research organizations or feel comfortable reaching out and making connections, if every single Chicagoan reached out to one family or to one individual, we'd be looking at a very different situation.
I think that there are some dynamics around race. You know, we had over 35,000 or so Ukrainian refugees come almost in the same period, but a little longer, to the Chicago area where we have a great Ukrainian community already. And there wasn't a backlash. And also the reasons for the migrating, they were facing a war, right? And people saw that as maybe a more legitimate reason. And they were given a status different than the new arrivals. But so that is something for us to really think about, is how do we acknowledge and admit that there are racist things based on race that are impacting people's perception. And I really think that this understanding that by helping people who are in this vulnerable situation, it really helps all of us. We have to find a way for people to truly understand that we did not have big encampments in Chicago the way other cities did. We didn't have people, and there are some folks who are struggling and are outside asking, you know, for money or different things, but not necessarily in the high numbers of unsheltered people that would have been the case in other places. So that meant that they were not in people's neighborhoods causing other problems, and we didn't see an increase in crime, things that people always want to attribute to immigrant or migrant communities, and that we know are not real, actually. But how do we, you know, how do we bring people along, and also how do we really just reflect and accept that there's racism that impacts how people respond to immigrants and new arrivals. And then just in terms of getting to know people, I was invited by several churches early on. Many small Black churches hosted new arrivals, and they went, when people said that, oh, you know, some folks in the Black community don't want the migrants, there were many people who were very helpful, and they used Google Translate to talk to each other. They turned their small services bilingual. You know, it was so heartwarming to see that really dispel this notion that everyone was against them, but it just took that human getting to know each other and making the effort to do it.
As I'm listening to you all and looking at the topic, I reflected a lot on the Cranes magazine forum that came out June 2022. And not but 2 months thereafter, we started to really see it in live motion, have some of these prospects tested. But that Cranes magazine forum had a lot of different articles about the outlook of being able to build on our workforce, being able to have the influx of migrants, climate migrants was the term used in that piece, as an opportunity for Chicago, Cook County to be able to increase our population, because the state of Illinois has greatly lost population in the last 2 census. And if there's any reason that we haven't lost even more population, it has been because of the influx of migrants. And so there's a really powerful picture of how we could see this as a positive economic impulse for our region that got tested. And I'd like to think that maybe it was the rapid influx that really made it difficult, and perhaps, not perhaps, it was also met with some challenges in the political and racialization of the subject. But now with the lessons that we have, having put the stress in all of these different infrastructures, how can we move forward and build from this, build with all of the people that are here, that we have made those connections with, that are in our schools, that are working in our manufacturing sectors and different industries, that are buying homes in disinvested communities that have lost populations. How can we build from that?
Well, I can start, but I will say we have to do it with humility and with respect for the communities where people have moved in, because people do feel displaced. And we have to just acknowledge that, right? That one community is leaving and a new community of a different color is moving in, and there's some feelings about that. But it is an opportunity to revitalize. I think as the city moves forward with our, building affordable housing, with workforce development, looking at our schools, we have highlighted not just the recent arrival of this community, but just immigrants and refugees in general as a population to keep in mind and to center along with others, because we do know there's so much data that shows that immigrants help boost increased population, job growth, they fill the jobs, they bring a wide variety of their high rates of entrepreneurship. There's so many positives. But I do think that we have to do it in a way that doesn't make another community feel less than or forgotten again. And it's hard to find the right balance, but it is a challenge that we have to take on.
If I could jump in very quickly, I think something that's also important to consider is that we are existing within a perpetual uneven state of campaigns and very specific amplifications, digital and public. So things like the Great Replacement theory, which is entirely horrendous and normally lives in the fringe of media and discussions, is now being pushed to the mainstream through various in-person and digital channels. And so part of that perspective, because we're coming back to community and mutual aid being a natural extension of society and how we are, we should be aware that we are doing this in a context of, we need to proactively address these horrendous campaigns that are trying to influence social perspective.
Just in terms of workforce development, and I'm so glad you said something about that, Cranes, that research report group. I had a good friend who actually recommended I read it before I come on this panel. She's here, Florida. Thank you so much for that. Is that the economic outlook for the state of Illinois is a bleak one, to your point. Generationally, our parents' generation, Generation X, we are they're either retiring out, we're having less children, and our dependence on the immigrant community to do caregiving, to do agriculture, these industries that really very much depend on that worker community are going to be critical to the economic well-being of our state. So I can't imagine that this current administration, and not just our state, but our country, right? I can't imagine that our administration is overlooking that fact from an economic perspective. So my hope is that, what we're seeing here is devastating in terms of the decisions and policies that are coming down, but I'm hoping that it is some strong arming that then will perhaps minimize with time.
There's an organization called the American Business Immigration Coalition, and they're trying to make that economic case, and they're bipartisan and really trying to shine a light on that at the federal level. I struggle with that because I think that we should value what immigrant, refugee, migrant communities bring because of who they are, not because of what they can do for us. But sometimes you have to make that economic case, right? That they are our caregivers and hospitality workers and farmers. But we should just be okay with having people from different backgrounds and different parts of the world be part of our communities and understand that, just by bringing who they are, that enriches our community. But there are folks certainly making that case. And in Illinois, just I guess one last thing, you know, we are so fortunate to live in Chicago, Cook County, Illinois, because we have laws that uphold and protect immigrants to some degree. In Chicago, our city services, we can never ask anyone their immigration status or discriminate against them for getting a library card or registering their child in school. That is not the case in other places. And the state of Illinois is also very welcoming to, excuse me, to immigrant communities. So we can't take that for granted.
The only thing that I would add is that the country was built by immigrants, and I think it's important to think about it with the lens of also what can the country do for immigrants, right? So
I think that's a perfect note to close on. Want to leave time for additional conversations, and thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to you all for coming out, and thank you to Delta.
Yes, we at the Institute cannot thank you all enough for being a part of this important conversation tonight, especially a huge thank you to our incredible panelists for sharing their expertise, insights, and lived experiences. Can I get a round of applause one more time? Before we wrap up, I just want to remind you there is still some food and drinks available, so please stay to enjoy. Chat, last call for beer and wine is at 7:40 p.m. Our silent auction is still open, with all proceeds supporting the Delta Institute on their work in environmental resilience and sustainability. And if you are interested, you can find QR codes available around the room near the bar, linking to actionable resources. So whether you're wanting to look for ways to advocate, support climate migrants, or simply deepen your understanding of today's discussion, I highly encourage you to check those out. They will also be in a follow-up email for attendees. We hope you tonight feeling educated, inspired, and empowered to take action in your own communities. So simply thank you all again for being here, and let's continue to see these critical conversations beyond tonight. Have a great evening.
I'm with Cyprite Volunteering.
Yes! Oh my God!
Mile.
Yes! We had you guys out last summer. It was so great to have you then.
Summer or fall, I can't remember.
Something around then.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say hi.
So good to see you
James,
again.
you were
Maya.
Maya.
Yes.
You were astounding being our natural guy.